On the backroads of South Africa, a lone Bakkie moved like a shadow, leaving silence where life had been. This is the hunt for the man who turned quiet towns into killing fields, and the profiler who refused to let him vanish. The air that morning carried a weight, as though the town itself knew something was coming. Mist clung low to the streets, turning the street lamps into hazy globes of orange light. In the Cape Flats, mornings like this could make even the most familiar neighborhoods feel strange, as if the geography itself had shifted overnight. For the people of Mitchell's Plain, that sense of unease had been growing for years. It began, as such stories often do, not with a single shocking event, but with whispers. Children gone missing, boys who never made it home from the corner shop, the soccer pitch, or the schoolyard. At first, in a community where families often shared small homes and children drifted between relatives' houses, these disappearances didn't raise the alarms they should have. A boy missing for a night might simply be sleeping at an aunt's house. A cousin might take him in for the weekend. But eventually, patterns began to emerge. Patterns too grim to ignore. By early 1994, the whispers had turned into a roar. The newspapers called him the Station Strangler. 21 young boys, all found in the dunes around Mitchell's Plain and nearby areas, dead by strangulation. Each case carried the same haunting details. Small bodies of boys aged 8 to 15, hands tied behind their backs, clothing used as ligatures. Many had been sexually assaulted. The dunes, vast, sandy stretches bordered by scrub and the occasional footpath, were both playground and graveyard, hiding what the wind would not reveal. This was the South Africa of the early 90s, on the edge of seismic political change. The first democratic elections were weeks away, and the country's attention was split between the excitement of a new era and the violence still woven into daily life. In the Cape Flats, crime was already a constant. Gang turf wars, drugs, armed robberies, these were not abstractions but part of the rhythm of existence. Murder was tragically common. But this was different. These killings had a signature. Someone out there was hunting children. It was into this atmosphere that a profiler was called down from Pretoria. Someone new to the South African Police Service, but already deeply aware of the mental terrain she was stepping into. Her task was to give shape to the shadows, to imagine the man behind these murders without ever having met him. That required more than theory. It required stepping into the abyss where such a person lives. Arriving in Cape Town, she found herself among detectives who had been wrestling with the case for months. Some were locals who knew every alley and every shortcut in Mitchell's Plain. Others had been drafted in from different parts of the country, brought together for one purpose: to stop the killings. The atmosphere was tense, chaotic even. In the police yard, caravans served as makeshift offices. Maps were pinned to walls. Lists of suspects were long and ever-changing. Everyone knew that while they talked, someone out there might be watching a boy at a corner shop, planning his approach. The first days were spent sifting through case files, building victim profiles, walking the ground where bodies had been found. The dunes were deceptive, peaceful under a hot sun, the wind whispering through dry scrub. But here the killer had worked. These remote pockets of sand and brush gave him time. The boys must have trusted him enough to follow him here. That trust was the weapon he wielded before anything else. It was clear from the start that this was not random violence. The victims were all boys, similar in build, close in age. The offender knew the area intimately. He was organized enough to choose secluded locations, confident enough to move freely without drawing suspicion. The profiler began to assemble a picture. A local man, likely in his late 20s or early 30s, of the same racial background as the victims, someone who moved easily among children. A teacher, perhaps, a coach, a mentor figure, someone who could mask danger with charm. But there was something else, an indication that this killer cared about details in ways most criminals didn't. In one case, a note was found on a victim's body, almost like a correction to the police's understanding of his crimes. That kind of behavior suggested control, precision, even pride. This was a man who wanted his work to be recognized correctly, and that made him dangerous in a different way. As the task team pushed forward, they weren't just hunting a killer. They were also managing the raw emotions of a community on edge. Parents walked their children to and from school. Any strange man seen with a boy risked being chased down, sometimes beaten, before police could even ask questions. Rumors spread faster than evidence could be gathered. At times, the community's desperation to help threatened to destroy what little physical evidence could be found. In that kind of environment, the investigation had to move fast. Leads were followed day and night. Suspects came and went by the dozens. Some clearly unrelated, others dangerously close to fitting the profile. And all the while, in the profiler's mind, the image of the man sharpened. She could feel the edges of his personality, the rhythms of his compulsion. He had been doing this for years. He knew the rush of it, the way the act restored something inside him when his own life felt out of control. The challenge was to find him before that compulsion drove him to strike again. But even as the team tightened its net, the killer was already watching his next opportunity. Somewhere in the dunes, the wind moved the sand just enough to hide and reveal the past. Graves, footprints, fragments of lives that ended too soon. And in the streets of Mitchell's Plain, boys still played, unaware of how close danger might be. The hunt had begun in earnest. The station strangler was not a phantom. He was flesh and blood. Somewhere in the Cape Flats, he was moving among the crowd, speaking to shopkeepers, passing parents on the street. He might have been buying groceries, greeting a neighbor, standing at the edge of a soccer field. The knowledge that he was hiding in plain sight gave the investigation a certain tension. Every man who fit the profile could be him, and every day without an arrest felt like an invitation for him to act again. The task team settled into a rhythm born from necessity. Mornings began early, the air still heavy with mist, as detectives reviewed new tips and sightings. Each lead carried the possibility of a breakthrough, but most dissolved under scrutiny. A neighbor's suspicion turned out to be a grudge. A man seen walking with a boy was a father on his way home. But the volume of information pouring in was a sign of how deeply the case had gripped the community. Patrols swept the dunes regularly, but they were vast, and the sand shifted constantly. Evidence could be swallowed in days. More than once, a promising scene was compromised before forensic teams could work it. Burned by vigilantes, trampled by searchers desperate to help. The profiler had seen this before in other cases. When fear takes root, it spreads faster than any official search pattern. What she saw in the case files disturbed her most. The way the killings seemed to happen in bursts. Years could pass between murders, then suddenly bodies would appear in rapid succession. This was the signature of someone who could suppress his urges for long periods, but not forever. When the compulsion broke through, it would come hard and fast, almost as if he were making up for lost time. That pattern meant the team might be in the middle of such a surge. The profiler spent hours building her psychological portrait. This man had almost certainly been abused in his own youth. Sexualized violence against children rarely comes from nowhere. His choice of victims wasn't random. It was rooted in his own history, in an age where he himself had been powerless. Now, he was rewriting that story, casting himself in the role of the aggressor. The killings weren't just acts of violence. One thing became clear. He was deliberate. The choice of location, the method of restraint, the use of clothing as a ligature, all pointed to a killer who planned his crimes with care. Even the decision to target boys in public spaces showed confidence. He could approach them without setting off alarm bells, charm them into following him, and lead them to the dunes without struggle. That kind of skill meant he had spent time studying children, not as a teacher in the formal sense, perhaps, but in a role that gave him access and trust. It was around this time that a name began circulating in hushed tones among the detectives. Willie. He wasn't the killer, but he had inserted himself into the investigation in ways that were both strange and unsettling. Willie hung around the task team's caravans, offering help, weaving himself into conversations as if he were part of the unit. Psychopaths sometimes drift toward investigations of their own crimes, but others are drawn to the power and drama of a major case. Willie was one of the latter, manipulative, charismatic, and entirely self-serving. He became a distraction, soaking up the team's time with bizarre theories, like the idea that the Strangler was using underground sewer tunnels to move unseen. But while side characters like Willie provided moments of absurdity, the core of the work remained deadly serious. Every new victim was a reminder of the stakes. One body in particular brought the horror home for the profiler. The child lay in a shallow hollow between dunes, dressed only in underwear, hands bound behind his back. His track pants, once a sign of a carefree morning, a day that should have been filled with games or errands, had been used to take his life. His red sneakers were placed nearby, alongside a small toy. The heat and the insects had already claimed much of what the body could tell, but the scene spoke volumes about control, ritual, and cruelty. Standing there, the profiler felt the full weight of the case pressing in. Here was the human cost, an entire life cut short and reduced to a set of forensic details. Yet even in that moment, she knew the work demanded more than grief. It demanded clarity, because every detail could bring them closer to the man who had done this. Back at the operations base, the atmosphere was changing. Weeks of round-the-clock work had worn down the detectives. Tempers flared. Fatigue dulled sharp instincts. The profiler felt it too, the sense that the killer was moving just beyond their reach, perhaps even aware of the pressure closing in. The community's anxiety was reaching a boiling point. Parents were clinging tighter to their children. Rumors of vigilante plans reached the team almost daily. And in the midst of it all, there was the chilling certainty that the man they sought might be walking past them on the street, blending in, waiting for the next chance to act. The profiler's picture of him was nearly complete. The challenge now was to match that picture to a real man before another boy's absence was explained not by a knock on the door, but by the wind uncovering another shallow grave in the dunes. The break didn't come in the form of a dramatic chase or a sudden confession. It came quietly, from the watchful eyes of someone who knew her community well enough to notice when a stranger didn't belong. In the coastal town of Strand, 20 kilometers from Mitchell's Plain, a woman named Fozia Hercules sat outside a shopping center one Friday afternoon. She wasn't there for any special reason, just waiting for her daughter. But as she scanned the foot traffic, her gaze landed on a man she didn't recognize. That was unusual. In tight-knit areas, faces become familiar over time. Outsiders stand out. The man's attention was fixed on two boys sitting on the curb, eating hot, greasy French fries from a paper packet. He walked over, spoke to them, and they seemed to respond easily. No fear, no hesitation. Within minutes, they were carrying boxes for him, heading toward the nearby train station. The boxes looked light, too light for the reward he promised them. Hercules recognized the boys. One was named Elroy. The other was his cousin, Rhino. Something about the scene troubled her. She didn't intervene in the moment, but the memory lodged itself in her mind. A week later, when she heard that Elroy had vanished and Rhino was the only one to return, the pieces clicked into place. She went to see the boy's grandmother, Uma Van Rooy, and met Rhino, who told her what had happened. He said that as they neared the station, he became uneasy. The boxes were empty. He remembered hearing about the station strangler in neighboring Mitchell's Plain. He dropped his load and urged Elroy to do the same. But Elroy stayed, confident he wouldn't be tricked. He followed the man onto a train. It was the last time anyone saw him alive. Hercules and Rhino worked with police to create an identikit of the man. For the first time in months, the investigation had something tangible, an eyewitness account and a face to pair with the profile. The focus shifted to the Strand. The task team's daily routine, long hours combing Mitchell's Plain, now included new ground. They canvassed neighborhoods, talked to residents, and checked transient populations. The change in scenery was welcome, but it didn't make the work any less dangerous. One morning before sunrise, a tip came in. The suspect might be living in a particular shack in a nearby squatter camp. The camp was a warren of corrugated iron, wood, and cardboard, its alleys barely wide enough for two people to pass. Numbers painted on the walls served as addresses, though they followed no order anyone could make sense of. The detectives went in heavily armed. Automatic weapons at the ready, they moved in pairs through the narrow paths, stepping quietly to avoid waking dogs or alerting residents. The profiler was with them that morning, her boots crunching softly on the dirt. the metallic scent of damp corrugated iron hanging in the air. At one point, she crouched to greet a stray dog lingering near a doorway, only to be pulled back by a detective who reminded her, gently but firmly, that a single sheet of metal could conceal an armed threat. In these tight quarters, there was no margin for error. They found the shack in question. A man answered, visibly agitated, relieving himself just beside the doorway as he spoke to the lead detective. The exchange was terse but calm. Inside, the shack was unexpectedly neat. Carpets, basic furniture, signs of a settled life in a place that appeared chaotic from the outside. But the man they were looking for wasn't there. Within minutes, the noise of the search spread through the camp. Voices rose. Doors slammed. The team decided to pull out before the situation turned volatile. The profiler followed one of the largest detectives through the maze of shacks, his bulk clearing a path in a way she knew she could never manage alone. Later, over coffee in the home of a local detective, the early morning adrenaline ebbed. The sun was just breaking the horizon, painting the ocean in pale pinks and golds. The profiler walked to the end of the pier, the salt air filling her lungs, the crash of waves beneath her feet. It was one of those moments where the world looked too beautiful to hold such darkness. And yet, she knew, somewhere out there, the man they sought was planning his next move. By mid-April, the tension was near breaking point. The task team's work was relentless, their bodies running on caffeine and willpower. Then, on the morning of Friday the 13th, the call came in. A nurse at a private clinic had contacted police, saying she suspected one of her patients might be the station strangler. He fit the public profile. He resembled the identikit. And there was something about him, aloof, resistant to treatment, prone to wandering at night, that kept her uneasy. The detectives put him under surveillance. They saw him leave the clinic under cover of darkness, returning hours later. When they finally stopped him and asked him to come to the station, he agreed without hesitation. He said he'd rather write down the story of his life than speak it. Pages later, the detectives had a partial confession, buried under deflection and half-truths, but unmistakable in its implications. His name was Avzal Norman Simons. He was 27, a teacher, and as the profiler would soon see for herself, he was exactly the kind of man she'd been imagining for months. The first meeting wasn't in an interrogation room. It was in the back seat of a car, rain streaking the windows, the Cape sky heavy with clouds. The profiler sat alone, waiting for the detectives to finish speaking with a psychiatrist inside Valkenburg Psychiatric Hospital. She had been invited to observe, but not to lead, and the exclusion gnawed at her. Then the back door opened. Someone slid in without a word. The air in the car shifted. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The stillness was too deliberate, the silence too full. But when she did face him, there was nothing theatrical about the moment. Just a man, dressed neatly, eyes dark and direct. Avzal Norman Simons. For months he had been an outline in her mind, details, patterns, and instincts forming a shadow figure. Now the shadow had substance. His handshake was firm. His voice was calm. There was no trace of the rage or cruelty his crimes suggested. He wanted to know what would happen to him. She told him honestly she didn't know. They spoke for 20 minutes. In French, at times, Simons was fluent. He talked about classical music, about teaching, about wanting to visit Denmark someday. On the surface, it was an ordinary conversation between two strangers. But beneath it ran an undercurrent of calculation. Simons was measuring her as surely as she was measuring him. Each detail he offered was deliberate, a crafted fragment of the image he wanted her to see. The profiler understood this dance. This wasn't about facts, it was about building a channel. If he believed she could understand him, not excuse but understand, he might step closer to revealing the truth. In the abyss of his mind, that bridge mattered more than threats or evidence. Back at the station, the detectives closed in on the case's practical side. The search of his family home, where he lived with his mother, stepfather, and sister, had turned up something unsettling. Clothing belonging to his deceased older brother. It was a small detail, but in cases like this, small details could be threads that unraveled bigger truths. Simons's background began to take shape. Born and raised in the area, he was a familiar figure in his community, a teacher at a local primary school. He was soft-spoken, well-groomed, and, by all accounts, dedicated to his work. Parents trusted him. Children liked him. That was the armor. Beneath it was the man who had stalked the dunes for years, blending routine and atrocity in ways that made him nearly invisible. In the interview room, he didn't rage or break down. He didn't deny his past abuse, being sodomized by his older brother when he was a child, but he also didn't fully claim the crimes. He sat in the gray space between confession and performance, as though keeping the final truth for himself was part of the power he still held. The profiler knew she couldn't force him to hand it over. That wasn't how this worked. Instead, she looked for ways to draw him out, to step into his mental landscape without letting him pull her under. It was a dangerous balance, getting close enough to see the world through his eyes without losing sight of where she stood. The detectives, meanwhile, worked methodically. Witness statements were lined up. Forensic evidence was reviewed and matched. The identikit was compared to Simons's features. The sightings in Strand, the abduction of Elroy and Rhino, all of it began to tighten around him like a net. Outside the station, the news of his arrest began to ripple through the community. Relief mixed with anger. Parents wanted justice, and many wanted it swiftly. In Mitchell's Plain, where fear had been a constant companion for months, the idea that the man who had haunted their streets was behind bars felt almost too good to believe. Inside, the profiler sat across from him again, the conversation careful, circling. She could feel the quiet pride in him, the belief that he had played a game for years and only now been caught. The challenge was to make him talk, not because he had to, but because, on some level, he wanted to. That was the beginning of the long, uneasy rapport that would carry through the rest of the case. And though he was now in custody, the shadows he had cast over the Cape Flats would not disappear overnight. For the families of the boys he killed, the arrest was only the start of another ordeal. The slow, grinding process of justice. The interview room was small, windowless, the kind of space designed to strip away distractions. No clock, no natural light, just the sound of breath, the creak of a chair, the occasional scratch of a pen against paper. It was in rooms like this that battles of will were fought, not with raised voices or threats, but with pauses, with the timing of a question, with the steady meeting of eyes. Simons was composed, as though he had rehearsed for this moment. He crossed his legs neatly, his hands folded in his lap. There was no fidgeting, no visible discomfort. The profiler had seen this before, the mask of control worn by someone who needed to project superiority even in captivity. But she also knew masks slip when the right pressure is applied. She didn't start with the crimes. That would have been a mistake. Instead, she asked about his life in neutral tones, his teaching, his routines, the music he liked. She let the conversation settle into something ordinary, as if they were two acquaintances meeting by chance. This was the first step, dismantling the formal dance of interrogator and suspect and replacing it with the illusion of an equal exchange. In truth, it was anything but equal. Every question was chosen to steer him closer to the edge of the abyss without triggering resistance. Every answer he gave was weighed not just for what he said, but how he said it. When the topic of childhood came up, Simons's control didn't falter, but his eyes shifted ever so slightly. He spoke about being sodomized by his older brother, not with outrage, but with a detached precision, as if reciting a fact rather than reliving an experience. For the profiler, this detachment was telling. It suggested he had compartmentalized that trauma so deeply that it had become part of the architecture of his mind, shaping him without his conscious permission. In cases like his, the cycle was often tragically familiar. A boy, powerless and violated, grows into a man who reclaims that lost power by reversing the roles. The victims chosen are stand-ins, not for the act itself, but for the helplessness it created. The killing is the final seal on that reversal, the ultimate control over a life. Simons didn't resist the profiler's presence, but neither did he rush to open himself up. She noticed the way he tested boundaries, offering just enough to keep her engaged, but holding back the core truths. It was a game to him, and he enjoyed the fact that she knew it. That enjoyment was dangerous. Over multiple sessions, the profiler used silence as much as speech. Long pauses where Simons could feel her waiting. Moments when his own words echoed in the stillness, inviting him to fill the gap. People who live inside their own narrative often can't stand the quiet. They need to keep shaping it, controlling it. In those moments, he would sometimes reveal small, unintended details. A choice of the detectives came and went, their work more direct, tying him to evidence, building the case for court. They didn't always understand the slower pace of her conversations with him, the way the groundwork of trust could eventually coax out admissions that force alone might never achieve. Outside the interview room, the case was tightening. The identikit match, the witness testimony, the physical evidence. It all formed a lattice that Simons could not easily escape. But inside, the profiler was chasing something more elusive, the pattern of his thinking. If she could understand his triggers, his rituals, his points of weakness, she could not only help seal the case but also provide insights for future investigations. Simons, for his part, seemed to relish the attention. In the sterile room, he was no longer just a suspect. He was a figure of fascination, the center of a narrative being built around him. The profiler knew this was part of the risk. Giving him a stage, even a small one, could feed the very self-image that had fueled his crimes. That was the line she walked each time they met, close enough to see the world through his eyes, far enough to remember that she wasn't there to save him. She was there to help close the book on the man who had haunted the dunes for years, and to make sure no one else would ever trust him again. The arrest of Avzal Norman Simons was a turning point, but it didn't lift the tension. In Mitchell's Plain, relief was braided tightly with suspicion. People had lived with the fear of the station strangler for too long to believe the danger was over in an instant. Parents still clutched their children's hands on the way to school. Boys still played within shouting distance of home. The dunes still loomed as silent reminders of what had been lost. For the task team, the days after the arrest were just as demanding as the manhunt. They had a suspect, but in the justice system, suspicion wasn't enough. Every link had to be proven. Every detail had to stand up to scrutiny in court. A misstep here could undo years of work. Witnesses were revisited, statements sharpened. Rhino, the boy who had walked away from Simons at the train station, was interviewed carefully, his memory a fragile but vital piece of the puzzle. Mrs. Fozia Hercules repeated her account, her steady voice masking the quiet satisfaction of having noticed what others had missed. The profiler's work shifted from hunting to refining. She combed through her notes from the interviews with Simons, looking for moments where his own words had betrayed him. A casual slip from past to present tense. A description of the dunes that was too vivid to be secondhand. An odd fixation on the sequence of victims. All of it could be useful, not just to understand him, but to help the prosecution show the jury the mind behind the crimes. Simons himself remained composed in custody. He didn't lash out or plead. He moved through the prison system like a man who had already accepted his new reality, or perhaps one who believed he could manipulate it. The profiler had seen it before, how some offenders treated the legal process as another arena in which to play their game. In the community, the emotions were harder to contain. Families of victims wanted the trial to begin immediately. Some were willing to speak to the press, their grief raw but controlled. Others avoided reporters entirely, unwilling to have their children's names and faces dragged across television screens again. There were vigils, too, candles flickering in the evening wind, small circles of people who refused to let the boys be forgotten. The detectives, still working long hours, had to navigate this emotional landscape carefully. They couldn't promise what the court would decide. They couldn't speed up the process. But they could be present, listening when parents vented their anger, answering questions when they could. In a case like this, the relationship between police and community could make the difference between cooperation and chaos. The profiler understood the importance of that relationship. Mitchell's Plain had, against the odds, given her trust when she first arrived, something she didn't take lightly. Now she saw her role as twofold, to help secure a conviction and to help the community believe that the shadow over their streets was finally receding. As the trial date drew closer, the prosecution team began shaping their case. The physical evidence was strong, but the psychological profile added a layer the jury could feel. It wasn't just about showing that Simons could have committed the crimes. It was about showing that the crimes fit him, in a way they could never fit an innocent man. His history, his behavior patterns, the escalation of his killings. They painted a picture too precise to ignore. Still, everyone knew the defense would fight hard. They would question witness reliability, challenge forensic interpretations, and chip away at anything that looked circumstantial. In high-profile cases, the court became its own kind of battlefield, slower than the chase through alleyways and dunes, but just as relentless. For the profiler, the work wasn't over. Sitting across from Simons in the interview room, she could still feel the abyss between them, dark and vast. But now, for the first time, there was a rope across it, a legal process pulling him toward judgment. Whether he liked it or not, the stage where he had once been the hunter was about to become the stage where he was judged. The courthouse was nothing like the dunes where Simons had chosen his victims. It was bright, structured, and public, every word recorded, every movement scrutinized. Here, he couldn't disappear into sand and wind. Here, the ground rules were fixed, and they weren't his. On the first day of the trial, the public gallery filled quickly. Families of victims sat in quiet clusters, their grief made visible in the way they leaned toward one another. Journalists arrived early, cameras poised for the walk from the holding cells to the dock. Some reporters had been following the case since the early days of the killings. Others were there for the drama of a serial murder trial in a country still navigating its new democracy. When Simons entered, he carried himself with the same careful composure the profiler had seen in the interview room. His shirt was crisp. His posture was erect. If the man felt the weight of the charges, multiple counts of murder, he didn't show it. That, in its own way, was part of the story the prosecution intended to tell. The disconnect between the image he projected and the crimes he committed. The prosecution's opening statement laid the groundwork. A pattern of killings stretching back years. A clear victim type. A method repeated with chilling consistency. They promised to show not just that Simons was capable of these murders, but that his background, behavior, and access to children made him uniquely positioned to commit them without raising suspicion. Witness after witness took the stand. Rhino, older now but still carrying the weight of that day, described the man who had approached them outside the shopping center. His voice was steady, but the memory hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Hercules testified about what she'd seen from her seat outside the Strand shopping center. How the sight of a stranger with two local boys had caught her attention and stayed with her until it became the piece of the puzzle the police needed. The profiler's testimony was different. She didn't speak about catching Simons in the act, but about understanding the man who could commit such acts. She explained the profile she had built months before the arrest. A local man, late 20s to early 30s, trusted by children, likely a victim of abuse himself. She described the control evident in the crime scenes, the choice of victims, the careful selection of secluded locations. She outlined the way his behavior in interviews, calm, precise, and withholding, mirrored the control he'd exercised in the murders. The defense pushed back hard. They questioned the reliability of the identikit. They suggested alternative suspects. They hinted that the profile was too broad, that it could describe any number of men in the community. They pressed witnesses on small inconsistencies in their memories, trying to chip away at the narrative. But certain pieces were harder to explain away. The sightings, the match between the identikit and Simons's appearance, the testimony about his movements at night while in the clinic, and, perhaps most damaging, the subtle admissions he had made, details he should not have known unless he had been there. The profiler watched him closely throughout. In the early days of the trial, he seemed almost detached, as though the proceedings were happening at a distance. But as the evidence mounted, small changes crept in. Tightened jaw, a hand gripping the edge of the dock a little too firmly, The moments when the names of the victims were read out, and he looked down not with remorse, but with an expression she recognized as irritation, at being reminded of the weight of each life in the eyes of the court. For the families, the trial was both an ordeal and a necessity. Each day brought fresh wounds as details of the killings were laid out in clinical, forensic language. But it was also the place where their children's stories could be told in full, not as nameless entries in a police report, but as lives that had been lived and taken. By the time the closing arguments began, the room felt different. The prosecution's narrative was solid, the defense's counterpoints worn thin. The jury had been given a complete picture, not just of the evidence, but of the man himself, stripped of the control he valued so much. The verdict was near, and with it, the answer to the question that had hung over the Cape Flats for years. Would the man called the station strangler finally be held accountable for the boys he had taken? When the jury returned, the air in the courtroom was heavy. It was the stillness of people holding their breath, of families clinging to the fragile hope that this would finally be the day they could put a name and a face to justice. Simons stood as the verdict was read. Guilty, on multiple counts of murder, each one tethered to a boy whose name had been spoken in that room over the past weeks. Guilty, on the charges of abduction and sexual assault that tied the killings together in a pattern too precise to be coincidence. The words landed like the final clicks of a lock. For the families in the gallery, the reaction was a quiet storm. Tears, embraces, a few voices whispering prayers of thanks. Some simply stared straight ahead, absorbing the reality that the man who had haunted their nights and stalked their streets would not walk among them again. Simons's face barely shifted. No collapse, no outburst. The profiler recognized it for what it was, not acceptance but defiance. A refusal to give the room the satisfaction of seeing him break. For someone who had spent years controlling every detail of his crimes, the loss of control here was an unspoken humiliation. The sentencing followed quickly. Life imprisonment. In the South African context of the time, that meant he would spend decades behind bars. The freedom to roam the dunes replaced by the confinement of a cell. The judge's words were unflinching. These were crimes that had torn the heart out of a community, and the sentence had to reflect that. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed. Microphones, cameras, shouted questions. The story of the station strangler had drawn national and even international attention, and the image of Simons being led away in chains was the closing scene they had been waiting for. But for the people of Mitchell's Plain, this was not closure. It was only the end of one chapter. In the days that followed, the profiler felt the shift. Her role in the investigation was over, but the echoes of it lingered. She walked through the streets of Mitchell's Plain without an escort now, greeted by faces that recognized her not as an outsider, but as someone who had stood with them when the killings were still unsolved. That acceptance was something rare, and she carried it carefully. Yet there was no mistaking the toll. Months of immersion in the mind of a man like Simons leave their mark. The profiler had lived with his patterns, his compulsions, the silent logic that had driven him to lure and kill. She had seen the dunes through his eyes, felt the weight of the silence he left behind. Now, even with him locked away, fragments of that perspective lingered, unwanted souvenirs from the abyss. For the families, the legal victory didn't erase the absence. Bedrooms remained empty. School photos stayed frozen in time. Birthdays passed quietly, their meaning split between memory and loss. But there was also a measure of relief. The man who had taken so much from them could no longer take again. Mitchell's Plain began to breathe differently. Children played farther from home. Parents loosened their grip, if only slightly. The dunes, though still scarred by memory, became just dunes again. Wind-swept stretches of sand and scrub, no longer an open hunting ground. The profiler returned to Pretoria, back to her office, back to the other cases that waited. But she knew this one would never really leave her. It had been her first immersion into a serial killer investigation, the case that had tested every skill she had and every boundary she thought she could keep. And though she had walked out of the abyss, she understood now that part of it had come with her. Somewhere, deep inside, she also knew that this would not be the last time she stood in that darkness. In the weeks after Simons was locked away, the profiler's life began to resume its outward routine. But inside, the rhythm had changed. She had walked the fine edge between empathy and danger, knowing that to truly understand a killer you must sometimes stand uncomfortably close. Now, with the trial over, she found herself asking the same question over and over. How do you step back into the ordinary after you've lived for months inside the mind of someone like that? The answer was you didn't, not entirely, but you could learn to navigate the space between the world of the living and the world of the abyss. That meant sharpening the boundaries that had blurred during the Station Strangler case, the ones that had allowed Simons to fill her thoughts even when she was hundreds of kilometers away. Her next call-out came sooner than she expected. A string of murders in another province, different victims, a different hunting ground, but a pattern all the same. This time, she arrived with the weight of experience. She knew the signs of a task team teetering between focus and fatigue, the signs of a community ready to erupt into vigilante action. She knew how the early days could drown you in leads that went nowhere, and how to listen for the one detail that could break a case wide open. She also knew how easy it was to lose yourself in the persona of the killer you were hunting. During the Simons investigation, she had begun to feel his moods in her own body: irritation, restlessness, an edge of aggression that wasn't hers. It had taken weeks to shake. Now she set guardrails for herself. Deliberate breaks from case material, time outside the investigation's emotional gravity, conversations with colleagues that grounded her in the present. But some lessons from Simons she chose to carry forward. She had learned that charm and violence often coexist in the same person more easily than the public wants to believe. That someone could be a respected figure in their community, a trusted adult in the lives of children, and still harbor a secret world of predation. And she had learned that control over the victim, over the scene, over the narrative, was often the deepest vein in a serial killer's psychology. In this new case, she saw early echoes of that control. The killer had a ritual, a way of staging his crimes that suggested they were rehearsed in his mind long before they happened. To most, it would have looked like coincidence. To her, it was a signature. The detectives she joined on this case were curious about the Station Strangler investigation. They'd read the headlines, but now they wanted the inside story, how the profile had been built, how Simons had finally been cornered. She told them enough to be useful, but she didn't linger on the details. Some of what she had seen and felt during those months couldn't be translated into procedure. It lived in the realm of instinct, sharpened by experience and impossible to teach in a briefing room. What she could teach was the discipline of staying with the evidence while also reading the spaces in between. She showed them how to map a victim's last known movements not just on a chart, but against the offender's likely comfort zones. How to look for the invisible paths, the shortcuts, the overlooked spaces that a local would know instinctively. In quiet moments, she still thought of Mitchell's Plain, of the dunes and the wind and the children's laughter that had once floated across streets shadowed by fear, of Simons himself and the brief, strange intimacy of their conversations. She didn't mistake that intimacy for connection. It had been a tool, and one she would use again when the situation demanded it. But she never forgot the cost of holding it too long. The new investigation was just beginning. Somewhere out there, another man was moving through his own hunting ground, believing himself unseen. And as she stepped into the early stages of the hunt, the profiler carried with her the unshakable truth she had learned in the Station Strangler case. That the abyss was always waiting, and it would take you in if you let it, but it could also show you exactly where the darkness lived, if you dared to look closely enough. The first scene was in a small township tucked between rolling farmland and the outskirts of an industrial zone. It was quieter here than Mitchell's Plain. No endless grid of identical houses, no relentless traffic hum, but the stillness had its own tension. The victim was a young woman, early 20s, found in an abandoned shed on the edge of a maize field. The air inside was stale and dry, the dust disturbed in patterns that told a story before the forensics team even began their work. The way she had been positioned was deliberate, not carelessly dropped, not hastily concealed. The scene had been shaped by the man who left her there, as if the moment of discovery was part of the design. The profiler crouched beside the body, letting her eyes move slowly over the details. Unlike Simon's, this killer hadn't used the victim's own clothing as a weapon. There was no attempt to create a makeshift ligature from what she wore. Instead, a length of cord, common hardware stock, had been used, tied with the kind of knot you'd learn only from repeated practice. The victim's shoes were neatly placed to one side, almost symmetrical. That small detail sent a flicker of recognition through the profiler's mind. She had seen this kind of ritual before, not in Simons's work, but in other cases where control was expressed through arrangement, through a need to leave things just so. It wasn't about hiding the crime. It was about leaving a mark invisible to most, but satisfying to the killer. Unlike Simons, who preyed on children and relied on charm to lure them, this offender had approached an adult victim. That meant a different set of skills. Confidence in overpowering someone physically, perhaps, or the ability to disarm suspicion in another way. The profiler noted the absence of signs of a prolonged struggle. Whatever had happened in that shed, it had been fast, efficient. The local detectives were wary. They'd dealt with homicides before, but the idea of a serial offender was one they didn't want to entertain too quickly. A single murder could be explained by motive, by opportunity, by a moment of rage, but the profiler knew better than to dismiss the possibility of a pattern just because the first case stood alone on paper. Back at the station, she laid out her early observations. This was likely not the killer's first murder. The precision of the scene suggested experience, perhaps crimes committed elsewhere before this one. The use of a controlled, portable weapon, a cord that could be carried unnoticed, hinted at planning, and the ritualistic placement of the shoes suggested a compulsion that was personal, not situational. The detectives listened, some skeptical, others curious. They asked about her work in Mitchell's Plain, about how she had known Simons's profile was accurate before the arrest. She explained that patterns reveal themselves in the smallest consistencies. The way a victim is approached, the choice of location, the sequencing of events. These things are as individual as handwriting, even when the killer tries to hide them. 2 days later, another body was found, this time in a disused workers' compound outside a rural factory. Another young woman, another length of cord, another pair of shoes placed neatly beside the body. The shift in the room was immediate. One murder could be an isolated act. Two, in such close succession and with such specific similarities, meant something else entirely. The air in the station grew heavier. Conversations turned quieter, and the profiler knew the hunt had begun again, not for a copy of Simon's, but for someone whose darkness was entirely his own. As she mapped the locations, she began to see the shape of the killer's world. The spaces he chose weren't the chaotic dunes of the Cape Flats. They were ordered in their own way, structures with boundaries, places that could be entered and exited without notice. He wasn't hiding in the open, blending into crowds. He was moving through pockets of isolation, striking where no one would hear, and leaving scenes arranged like signatures only he fully understood. It was a different kind of predator, but the abyss felt familiar all the same. The third body came less than a week later. This time, the location was an abandoned railway maintenance shed. The walls flaking with rust, the floor littered with splinters of broken wood and scraps of paper carried in by the wind. The air smelled faintly of oil and something older, rot lingering beneath the metallic tang. The victim, another young woman, was positioned with the same care as the first two. Shoes removed and placed neatly beside her. The same type of cord, the same absence of panic in the scene. It was as if the killer had been there for hours and still left without a single misstep. The profiler stood in the doorway, scanning the shed not for what was there, but for what was missing. There were no signs of forced entry, no scattered belongings beyond what the victim had brought. It wasn't the chaos of an opportunistic attack. This was precision, time, and control on the killer's terms. She knelt, examining the shoes. The soles were clean, too clean. He must have removed them early in the encounter, before leading or carrying her to the exact spot where he would kill her. That meant the ritual wasn't only about how the scene looked afterward. It was part of the process, woven into the sequence of control he needed to feel before the act itself. Back at the station, the map was changing. 3 pins now formed a rough triangle across the district, each scene near a transport link but far from where anyone might wander by. The killer was choosing locations with two things in common: privacy and quick escape routes. The profiler began sketching the first outline of his life. This was someone with mobility, access to a vehicle, likely one that didn't draw attention. He might work a job that kept him on the move, or one that offered stretches of unaccounted for time. He knew the back roads, the service lanes, the half-forgotten corners of rural infrastructure, and he had the confidence to bring victims to these places without fear of being interrupted. The escalation was impossible to ignore. In the Simons case, years had passed between some killings. This man was striking in rapid succession, as if driven by an urgency that left no time for cooling off. That pace carried a risk. The faster he killed, the more likely he was to make a mistake. But it also meant the team had less time to act before the next victim. The profiler warned the detectives in blunt terms. "He's not slowing down," she said in the cramped operations room, maps and case files spilling over the table. "If anything, the pattern suggests he's building momentum. If he's killing this often now, it's because something in his life is pushing him. Stress, a trigger event, something that's made the fantasy not enough anymore. That pressure won't stop until we do." Her words carried weight. Patrols were expanded. Plainclothes officers began moving through areas near bus stops and rail sidings, keeping watch for men approaching women alone. Community meetings were held, though the profiler knew these came with risks. Too much information could send the killer underground for a while, only for him to resurface later in a different territory. Privately, she studied the geography again, tracing his comfort zones. The spaces he chose weren't random. They formed corridors, invisible to those who didn't know the terrain the way he did. She imagined him driving at night, eyes scanning for someone who fit the vision in his head, then turning down the exact road that would lead to the place he had already chosen. The danger was clear. A killer this confident, this controlled, didn't need chaos to succeed. He thrived on order, on the quiet places where no one thought to look. And in that silence, he was growing bolder. The profiler knew they were racing a clock they couldn't see. The question wasn't if there would be a fourth body, it was when. The fourth scene felt different the moment she arrived. It was early morning, the kind of pale light that softens edges but makes colors sharper. The location was another abandoned structure, an old fruit packing shed on the outskirts of a farm. But this time, there was something the others hadn't had: a trace. The victim, again a young woman, was found in the same controlled arrangement. Cord around the neck, shoes set neatly beside her. But on the dusty concrete floor, just beyond the reach of her outstretched hand, was a faint impression in the dirt. Partial shoe print. It wasn't clear, not enough for a full identification, but enough to show tread. And that tread was distinctive. Not the smooth soles of dress shoes or the flat profile of cheap sneakers, but the deep, segmented pattern of a work boot. The profiler crouched beside it, careful not to disturb the outline. It wasn't much, but it was more than the killer had left before. And to her, the presence of the print said something else. For all his precision, he was human. Humans make mistakes when their pace accelerates. Later that morning, a second detail emerged. One of the farm's seasonal workers had seen a vehicle the night before. An older model Bakkie, pale blue or gray, parked near the shed. The driver had been standing outside, smoking. The witness hadn't seen his face clearly, but described him as medium build, wearing dark trousers and a jacket. It wasn't a perfect lead, but it was something to hang on to. Back at the station, the profiler began reshaping her working picture. The vehicle fit with her earlier assumption: mobility, a way to move victims discreetly. The work boots suggested either his job required them or he wore them deliberately, knowing they could handle rough ground. The smoking was interesting too. In cases like this, small habits could open doors. If they could find cigarette butts at a scene, they might get DNA. She also noted the psychological shift in the scene. The print and the sighting suggested he'd been less cautious. That could mean confidence tipping into carelessness, or that something had gone wrong. In her mind, she replayed the possible sequence. He meets her somewhere, roadside, bus stop, maybe a bar, and convinces or forces her into the vehicle. He drives to the shed, goes through his ritual, removal of shoes, the cord, the positioning. But something interrupts his rhythm. Maybe a sound outside, maybe the feeling of being watched. In leaving, he steps where he hadn't before, leaves the print, and is seen by someone he didn't know was there. The detectives began combing through reports of similar vehicles in the area, cross-referencing with men who had access to the kind of locations he was using. The profiler added another filter: men who worked in industries that took them across rural routes. Agriculture, transport, maintenance, jobs that made their presence in isolated areas seem unremarkable. 2 days later, another tip came in. A woman working at a roadside cafe remembered a man who matched the general description. He'd been in twice in the last week, driving a light blue Bakkie. He wore work boots. He didn't speak much, but when he did, there was a slight rasp in his voice, as if from years of smoking. It wasn't enough to move in, but it was enough to start watching. The profiler could feel it. The net was tightening. She'd seen this stage before. The moment when the killer still believes he's invisible, but the investigation has already begun to draw a circle around him. The trick was to let him keep believing that, just long enough for him to make the final mistake. She also knew the risk. A man like this, sensing pressure he doesn't yet understand, might speed up even more. And if that happened, there would be another body before they got to him. The first time they saw the Bakkie, it was almost a disappointment. No dramatic reveal, no cinematic moment, just a dusty light blue pickup parked outside a hardware store in a small rural town, its driver loading bags of cement into the back. He was leaner than the witness descriptions had suggested, his movements unhurried. A man who looked like he could vanish into any crowd of working men in South Africa. The detectives didn't move in. Not yet. The profiler had been clear. They needed to be certain before they acted. Arresting him too soon would mean gambling on the evidence they had, which was still circumstantial. Instead, they began to build the shadow around him. Surveillance teams rotating shifts, vehicles parked at distances that wouldn't draw his eye. For 2 weeks, they followed without being seen. The Bakkie was always moving, backroads, service lanes, routes that wound through fields and industrial yards. He worked construction jobs, casual labor, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. At night, he drove with no obvious destination, sometimes stopping at roadside cafes or bottle stores, sometimes just idling in the dark before moving on again. The profiler kept a map on the wall of the operations room, every stop marked in red. Slowly, patterns emerged. He never went near the towns where the victims had been found. Instead, he skirted their peripheries, moving through the kind of in-between spaces where a vehicle could pull off without being noticed. The map began to look eerily like the hunting corridors she'd seen in other cases, routes defined not by geography, but by opportunity. One night, a surveillance officer's voice crackled over the radio. "He's picked up a woman." The profiler was at the station when the call came in. Her first question was the only one that mattered. "Is she in danger now?" The officer hesitated. "Hard to say. They're just driving. No sign of struggle." The decision was a razor's edge. Intervene too soon and they risked tipping him off. Wait too long and they risked another victim. The profiler pressed for details where then came the breakthrough. One of the detectives digging into his background found a record of a prior arrest. Assault, years earlier, against a woman he'd met hitchhiking. The charges had been dropped when the victim withdrew her statement, but the details were too close to the current case to ignore. Same age range, same approach, same control over the victim's movements. The profiler's working theory crystallized. This wasn't a man discovering his capacity for violence. This was a man who had carried it for years, refining it, waiting for moments when the risk felt low enough to act. The recent spree wasn't the start. It was the escalation. With his name now in hand, the team began the process of tying him to the murders. They looked for receipts that put him near the scenes on the relevant days, for fuel records, for witnesses who remembered seeing the Bakkie. They revisited the cafe worker, the farm laborer, anyone who could place him within the narrow window of each killing. The profiler felt the tension in the room shift. They were no longer hunting a shadow. They were hunting a man whose face they could name, whose routines they could predict. And when you can predict, you can set the trap. The decision to move came earlier than planned. He'd been under watch for weeks, his routes and habits recorded with the precision of a ledger. But on a Friday evening, the profiler's unease sharpened into certainty. He was circling again, those slow, aimless loops along the backroads, pulling into laybys for minutes at a time, then moving on. The Bakkie was a predator's den on wheels, drifting through the dark. At 8:47 p.m., surveillance reported a change. He'd stopped near a roadside pull-off, where a lone woman was waiting, holding a shopping bag. The profiler knew what that meant before anyone said it. He'd spotted an opening. The command to move came fast. 2 unmarked cars swept in from opposite ends of the road, boxing him in before he could accelerate. A third pulled in behind. The scene, lit by headlights and dust, was as controlled as they could make it, speed without chaos. He didn't fight. When the officers pulled him from the driver's seat, he went limp in their grip, his expression unreadable. The woman was moved quickly to safety, shielded from the unfolding arrest. She didn't yet know how close she'd been to becoming the next body in the profiler's map. The profiler arrived minutes later, the Bakkie already sealed off for forensics. Standing in the glare of portable lights, she watched him. Medium build, work boots, jacket, the faint rasp of a smoker's breath. He was exactly what they'd been expecting and nothing like what the public imagined a killer to be. She introduced herself in the holding room hours later. He sat across the table, wrists cuffed, posture straight. No outward aggression, no attempt at charm. Just a steady, appraising look, as if he were the one studying her. "You've been busy," she said, her voice even. He smiled faintly, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "You think you know me?" "I know what you've done," she replied. He didn't confirm or deny, but the shift in his expression told her she'd landed closer to the truth than he wanted. The interview wasn't about confession. Not yet. It was about establishing the dynamic, reading the man behind the ritual. Back in the evidence room, the Bakkie was yielding its secrets. Coils of cord, identical to the type used in the killings. A pair of women's shoes, tucked neatly under the passenger seat. A crumpled packet of cigarettes, with at least 2 smoked but still inside, potential DNA. The profiler knew the case wasn't over. Arrest was just the first victory. Conviction required building the bridge between him and every victim in a way that could withstand the courtroom. But she also knew this. He wouldn't kill again. Whatever darkness had driven him across the rural backroads was now contained within 4 concrete walls. As dawn broke, she stepped outside the station. The air was cool, the first light catching on the edges of the fields beyond town. Somewhere, in the houses and farms that had been his hunting ground, people were waking up to a quieter world. One where the man they didn't know they feared was no longer free. And for the first time in weeks, the profiler allowed herself the smallest exhale of relief. He didn't talk at first, not in the way the public imagines killers do, with sudden bursts of confession or a smug recounting of their crimes. His silence wasn't stubbornness. It was a performance. Every pause, every non-answer, was calculated to remind her that he was still the one in control. The profiler had seen this before. Men like him believed the power of the hunt extended into the interview room, that withholding was just another way of dominating the space. So she didn't push hard. Not yet. The first hours were about building the rhythm, about showing him that she could sit in silence longer than he could. They started with neutral ground, his work history, the towns he'd lived in, the jobs that kept him on the road. He spoke sparingly, his voice carrying that same rasp the cafe worker had remembered. He talked about construction sites, seasonal work, helping out here and there. Nothing he said tied him to the murders, but everything he said confirmed what she already suspected. He moved constantly, knew the hidden places between towns, and had no one keeping track of his nights. When she brought up the women, his eyes narrowed just slightly. He didn't ask which women. That told her he already knew. "You've been watching me?" he said, more observation than accusation. "We've been trying to stop you," she replied. He smiled at that. Not the smile of a man amused, but of one who thinks he's being admired for his skill. She shifted the focus to his rituals. The cord, the shoes, the careful placement. He didn't flinch, but a muscle worked in his jaw. "You see patterns that aren't there," he said. It was the closest thing to a denial he'd offered. The profiler leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Patterns are just truths you don't want seen." It was a calculated line, and it landed. He looked away for the first time. Over the next sessions, the silences shortened. He still wouldn't admit to the murders outright, but he began to talk about things men do and moments when you can't stop yourself. He spoke in abstractions, as if putting a layer of fog over the details could keep him safe. The profiler let him. She knew the fog was where he felt most comfortable, but every vague statement was a thread she could follow, matching his language to crime scene behaviors, mapping his sense of compulsion against the timeline of the murders. The evidence outside the interview room was stacking up. The cord-matched fibers found at multiple scenes. DNA from the cigarette butts in his Bakkie matched a trace recovered from one victim's clothing. A traffic camera had caught his vehicle near the location of the third murder within an hour of the estimated time of death. Piece by piece, the bridge to conviction was being built. One afternoon, she slid a photograph across the table. A crime scene shot, cropped to show only the neatly placed shoes. "You made sure they looked right," she said. "You couldn't leave until they were just the way you wanted." His eyes fixed on the photo for a moment too long. "People don't understand order anymore," he muttered. "Everything's a mess." It wasn't a confession, but it was the first time he'd given her a glimpse of his why. Control. Order. A personal world in which his rituals made sense, even as they destroyed lives. The profiler knew they were close. He was speaking more now, testing the edges of disclosure, weighing what it would mean to tell the whole truth. And she was patient, because with men like him, the moment they break isn't a sudden collapse. It's a slow surrender, each word a step toward the weight they can no longer carry alone. It came late on the third week of interrogation. By then, the sessions had settled into a rhythm. Long silences, careful questions, the slow erosion of his control. The profiler had learned his tells. The way he'd shift his weight when she was close to something, the almost imperceptible pause before a deflection. That day, she brought nothing new into the room. No photos, no files. Just herself, a notebook, and the knowledge that sometimes absence was more unnerving than evidence. "You're not asking me anything today?" he said after a while, leaning back as far as the cuffs allowed. "I've already asked," she replied. "You've already answered. You just haven't said it in words yet." He studied her, weighing whether this was bait. She kept her expression steady, letting the silence press in. "It's not like they think," he said finally. "Who's they?" "The people out there. The ones who see the pictures. They think it's all the same. Like I didn't know them." This was new. He'd never spoken as if he did know his victims. She didn't move, didn't let the change in her breathing show. "So you did know them," she said softly. Some I'd seen before. You notice things. You remember faces." The words came slower now, but they kept coming. He spoke of routines, not just his, but theirs. The way one woman always took the same shortcut from the bus stop. The way another lingered outside a shop before heading home. He wasn't confessing to the killings outright, but he was mapping the moments that preceded them, as if reliving the hunt without naming the kill. When she asked why the shoes were always removed, his gaze dropped to the table. "It's respect," he said after a long pause. "You don't walk a person into death with their shoes still on." It was twisted logic, but it was logic all the same, his own moral code stitched into the violence. The profiler had seen this before. Killers who believed their rituals elevated the act, making it something almost ceremonial. Outside the interview room, the case was reaching its own tipping point. Forensics tied his DNA to 2 more victims. Witness statements placed his Bakkie within striking distance of all known crime scenes. The prosecution's file was becoming bulletproof. But inside the room, the profiler wasn't chasing evidence anymore. She was chasing truth. Not the kind needed for conviction, but the kind that explained why. "You've carried this alone for a long time," she said. "You're the only one who knows the real story. Doesn't it get heavy?" His eyes flicked up, and for the first time she saw something shift, pride giving way to something closer to weariness. "You think telling you changes anything?" he asked. "It changes you," she said, "and it makes the story yours before everyone else twists it into something it's not." He didn't answer, but his silence felt different now. Less like control, more like consideration. She knew then that the moment was coming. It wouldn't be today, maybe not tomorrow, but the weight was beginning to crack him open. It happened on a morning so ordinary that no one expected it. The profiler had gone into the interview with no plan to push for a confession that day. She intended to keep circling, giving him space to feel the pull of speaking without the pressure of demand. But as soon as she sat down, she sensed the shift. He was leaning forward slightly, wrists resting on the table, eyes fixed on a spot in the middle distance. When she greeted him, he didn't answer right away. "You said once," he began slowly, "that I'm the only one who knows the real story." "I remember," she said. "You were right." The words hung there, not quite a surrender but no longer a defense. He started with the first woman. Not the first he'd ever harmed. He admitted there were others before her, but the first in this series. He described the night air, the way the gravel crunched under the Backie's tires as he pulled off the road. He didn't name her, not at first. Instead, he painted the scene, her silhouette in the headlights, the way she hesitated before stepping toward him. The profiler didn't interrupt. She let the images come, sparse and precise. By the second victim, he was using names. His tone didn't change, it was still that same even, almost detached cadence, but the details sharpened. He spoke of the cord as if it were a familiar tool, the removal of the shoes as if it were a kindness. He remembered what each woman was wearing, where she stood when he first approached, whether she spoke to him, and if so, the last thing she said. There was no remorse in his voice, but there was something else, an insistence that the story be told exactly as it happened, that the order of events be correct, that no gesture or word be misplaced. It was the same need for control that had defined his crime scenes, now applied to his own narrative. By the time he reached the fourth victim, the profiler could feel the weight of the room changing. The tape recorder hummed steadily between them. Outside the glass, detectives listened in silence, some with their heads bowed, others staring at the wall as if trying not to absorb the imagery. When he finished recounting the last killing they knew about, he paused. "There were more," he said quietly. "How many more?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back, eyes narrowing. "You tell me," he said. It was a test, and she knew it. She listed the unsolved cases that matched his pattern, one by one. After each, he gave the smallest nod, barely there but unmistakable. When it was over, the total was higher than the task team had feared. Higher than any of them had prepared themselves to hear. The profiler kept her voice steady. "Why now? Why tell me this today?" He looked at her with something almost like relief. "Because you were listening," he said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an admission of guilt in the moral sense. It was simply the truth as he saw it. The story had been told, and he had chosen the person to carry it. The door closed behind her with a muted click, shutting him back into the interview room. For a moment, the profiler just stood in the corridor, the words still echoing in her head. Not the facts themselves, but the precision with which he had delivered them. It was as though he had been rehearsing for years. In the observation room, the detectives were silent. Some stared at the floor, others scribbled notes as if writing fast enough might keep the images from settling too deeply. A younger constable looked up at her, eyes wide. "So, it's really him. All of them." She nodded. "And more than we thought." The weight of that settled over the team like a second skin. They had suspected. They had mapped his movements, cross-referenced times and places. But hearing it from his own mouth was different. The cases that had lived as pins on a board, as lines in a file, were now bodies in the dirt again, each with a story that had just been told in unnerving clarity. The prosecutor came in within the hour. They reviewed the tapes together, pausing to mark timestamps where his language shifted from suggestion to explicit detail. Every nod, every name, every match to previously unpublicized facts was noted. The confession was strong, but it would be even stronger alongside the physical evidence already in hand. Outside the interview suite, the task team worked late, assembling the timeline for the prosecutor. The profiler sat with them, filling in the gaps only she could fill, the nuances of his behavior, the meaning behind the rituals, the context that turned his words from vague admissions into precise, prosecutable confessions. Around midnight, she stepped outside into the cool air. The town was quiet. Somewhere beyond the dark line of the fields was the silence he had once prowled through. A silence that had hidden the sound of tires on gravel, of doors opening in the dark. That silence would be different now. Inside, the team was still working. There would be more interviews, more court dates, more days spent revisiting scenes that were no longer active crime scenes but memorials. And she would have to sit across from him again. Not for information this time, but because the law would require it. But tonight, for the first time in months, she let herself believe that the map on the wall would stay still. No more new pins. No more fresh lines connecting them. Just the slow, deliberate work of closing the circle. The trial drew the kind of attention that transforms a courthouse into a theater. Each morning, long before the doors opened, people lined the steps, reporters with cameras, locals clutching notebooks, and families of the dead who had waited too long to see the man in the dock answer for what he'd done. Inside, the air was thick with the strange mixture of formality and tension that only a murder trial can produce. The accused sat between his attorneys, expression flat, his gaze rarely shifting. To the untrained eye, he might have seemed indifferent. The profiler knew better. His stillness was just another performance. Control in the one arena he could still influence. The prosecution wasted no time establishing the foundation. They opened with the forensic evidence. Fibers from the cord matched to multiple victims, DNA recovered from cigarette butts in his Bakkie, the partial shoe print from the packing shed linked to his work boots. Piece by piece, they built the physical scaffolding of guilt. Then came the confession. The court listened to the recordings, his voice steady as he recounted each killing. The prosecutor paused at key moments, where he named a victim, where he described a detail that had never been made public, where his own language betrayed the planning and ritual. Jurors shifted in their seats. A few looked at him directly, as if trying to reconcile the calm voice with the cruelty it described. The defense tried to dismantle the confession, claiming coercion, suggesting he'd been fed information by investigators. They painted him as a man cornered into saying what he thought the police wanted to hear. But the profiler's testimony undercut the narrative. She took the stand and explained the slow, deliberate process of their interviews, how much of what he revealed had not been asked, but volunteered. She described the consistencies in his accounts, the way they matched evidence the public had never known. She made it clear, this was not a man guessing his way through a police theory. This was a man recounting his own history. When the victims' families testified, the mood in the courtroom shifted. Gone was the clinical language of forensics and timelines. In its place came the raw, unvarnished grief of lives interrupted, the last moments they saw their daughters, sisters, mothers. Some spoke directly to him, their voices steady despite the years of silence. He did not respond. In her seat behind the prosecution's table, the profiler felt the impact ripple through the room. These weren't just case numbers. They were people whose absence had reshaped entire families, whose names had been reduced to lines in an investigation until now. The trial stretched on for weeks, each day grinding through the machinery of justice. Expert witnesses, cross-examinations, procedural challenges. Through it all, the profiler kept her focus on the goal, not to win an argument, but to make sure the truth held under the weight of the defense's attack. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom emptied into the corridor. The wait was long enough to feel endless. And then, in the space of a single breath, it was over. Guilty. On every count. The words landed not with a cheer, but with a deep, collective exhale, relief, grief, and exhaustion all braided together. The families embraced quietly. The profiler stood back, letting them have the space that was theirs by right. As the judge read the sentence, life without parole, she looked once at the man in the dock. His expression didn't change, but she knew this. For the first time in years, the roads he had once traveled freely were no longer his. The trial's end did not bring silence. For weeks afterward, the town streets carried the hum of conversations replaying every detail. The verdict, the sentencing, the way he'd sat unmoving as each count was read. In cafes, at petrol stations, in the narrow aisles of small shops, people spoke his name in low voices. It was as if saying it too loudly might conjure him back, even though they all knew he would never walk free again. The families moved differently now. Some came to the station to thank the task team, their gratitude carrying the weight of years without answers. Others stayed away, preferring privacy to public closure. The profiler understood both choices. Healing had no set shape. It moved in its own time. On the wall of the operations room, the map still hung, pins and strings untouched since the arrest. No one had the heart to take it down yet. It wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a record of the chase, a silent reminder of the work that had consumed them. Eventually, it would be archived. But not today. In the community, there was a subtle shift. The backroads where he'd once hunted were no longer empty at night. Neighbors kept closer watch on one another. Women traveled in pairs or with someone they trusted. It wasn't fear exactly, not anymore, but awareness. A kind of collective vigilance that would linger for a generation. The profiler found herself returning to certain scenes long after the case was closed. Not to investigate, but to stand in the quiet and feel the space without him in it. The abandoned packing shed, the roadside pull-offs, the fields where the wind moved freely now, unshadowed by his presence. In her own notes, she wrote something she never intended for a report. You can stop the man, but not the echoes. Because she knew there would always be echoes. The sound of tires on gravel, the sudden flash of headlights on an empty road, the stories whispered in kitchens long after children had gone to bed. This was the residue of his violence, and it would take more than a guilty verdict to erase it. Yet there was also something else. In the months after his sentencing, she began to see a resilience in the faces around town. The cafe worker who'd remembered his voice, the farm laborer who'd seen the Bakkie that night, the officers who'd tracked him mile after mile. They were not defined by what he had done, but by the fact that they had stood against it. On the day she finally removed the last pin from the map, she did it quietly. She rolled up the board, carried it to storage, and set it alongside the other closed cases. It was never about erasing the past. It was about making space for the next fight, the next shadow that would need chasing. Driving out of town that evening, she passed one of the old turnoffs he'd favored. The sun was low, the road empty. For the first time in years, she didn't imagine a Bakkie waiting there in the dark. The horizon was clear, and for now, that was enough.